to Monday Night Bible Study. Glad to see everybody tonight. We'll start in Romans chapter 13. We've already looked at a couple of things in Romans 13, and we'll do a just quick review over that since we've kind of already covered it a couple of weeks ago. And I don't want to just jump over it because it all kind of, it all goes together. But we'll go over it pretty quick. It's kind of appropriate that we're looking at things dealing with government since we're coming up on the election. And government is on everybody's mind today and all this kind of thing. So, if you remember, well, I guess, Troy, Jerry, y'all weren't here when we covered this a couple of weeks ago. Okay, well, good. So, anyway, we run through this. A couple of main points in this we want to look at anyway. So, let's go to our scriptures. Government takes different forms, but the principle of government is established by the Creator. And in these verses, as we've looked at, the point that Paul's making here is that God has established human governments for a particular, set of reasons. One of them is to maintain law and order among human society and culture. As we know, God doesn't directly himself regulate law and order in the earth, human governments, and things like that. Not that he doesn't work in those things, and not that he doesn't exercise some control, according to his will. But as we're going to look at here in a few minutes, as we go back to Genesis and see where God set these things in place, he expects people to take the wisdom that he gives us and form governments that are good for the people, and productive for people. Now, unfortunately, that has seldom happened through human history, but there have been times when, it has pretty well functioned. One of the things we also looked at in forms of government was that back in the early days, the kind of government that they had was a sort of a patriarchal or a tribal form of government, where they had tribal elders. The tribal elders, would get together, and if there was a problem, they'd try to solve it. They'd pretty much kind of determine what the tribe or the village needed to do, and so on. We have many accounts in the Bible where it talks about the elders sitting in the gates of the city, and that's where all of the business was transacted and the decisions were made and all that kind of stuff. So it really was kind of a pretty good system. It's a sort of an elder rule system, but in a lot of places, in a lot of ways, it worked pretty well. Mainly for those elders in the cities, everybody that they had anything to do with were their relatives. So, they could only get by with so much. Paul says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. There's no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. He has set in place human government. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. It's talking about resisting the ordinance of government that God has set in place. Now, this is an important point to remember about God setting the ordinance of human government in place, because where we're going to get to next week, we'll see this principle come into play strongly there. Now, next week, we're going to go into a subject that is one of the most important subjects for us to learn. That's when we get farther into chapter 13, down around verses 11 and 12 and so forth. And it's going to be, once we get there, that's one of those places where we're going to stop and we're going to spend some time to kind of stretch that out and look at it in all its components, because it's a really, really important biblical principle and concept for us to make sure we understand. It's kind of like one of those milestones, like a lot of the things, the sonship and our adoption and transformed by the renewing of our mind. These are milestones of understanding that we need, in place. So anyway, we'll get there, next week. Hopefully it's kind of appropriate with the time of year and whatnot. So, God does not want anybody to live under anarchy, and anybody that doesn't want any form of government whatsoever, basically an attitude of anarchy, that is really against the ordinance of human government that God has put in place. Paul goes on to say, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil." Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. That's generally true. The government's rulers, the governing authorities are there to punish evildoers, uphold the law. If you generally, if you obey the law, you don't really have anything to worry about. That's not always the case, but generally, pretty much that's the way it is. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So this, Paul emphasizing and supporting the principle of government having the power to uphold the law and actually to execute those who do things that are, worthy of some kind of capital punishment or whatever. He goes on to say, "Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake." Conscience, basically, you know what's right. I mean, it really, and this is a point that I make about, about the law and things like that. Okay, do any of us here need to see written down anywhere in the law that it's wrong for you to go and steal from your neighbor? No. Wherever those laws are written down, if suddenly they all vanished into thin air and they didn't exist anymore, that wouldn't give us the freedom to go and steal, because we know in our hearts, because it's a standard God put in place, not to steal and murder and, adultery and false witness and all those other things. We don't need written laws to, maintain our understanding that those right and wrong, because we have a conscience, and our conscience is hardwired into us by the one who created us. And the thing about it is, our conscience is always on God's side. It's never on our side. So, you're not going to slip much by your conscience. You may a little while, but still, it'll be there. He goes on to say, "For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due," and this, we talked about this last time, this is mainly like on the owned property and so forth, taxes. And customs to whom customs. Back in those days, a lot of stuff moved around, a lot of trade, and they produced a lot of stuff to ship somewhere or whatever. And you always had to pay customs. Just like today, you ship something into a country or out of a country, you have to pay customs on it. And all that, and has to go through inspections and all that kind of stuff. So there's that. And fear to whom fear. And this was mainly aimed at military authorities who were in your area. And remember, the people Paul's writing to are Romans. They're in Rome, and they're under a military authority. And anywhere they go in the Roman world, even if they are Roman citizens, they're still under Roman authority. So, fear to whom fear, because the military, if they have some reason to come against you, they can come against you. They can kill you and pretty much get away with it. They're justified to do it because they're the military power. So, and back in those days, there was a lot of insurrection against the Roman government. a lot of rebellion, constantly. If you ever read like Josephus' history, and some of those histories are written during Roman times, it's amazing how they were constantly having to fight, constantly protecting their borders. There were constantly some leader over here, he would raise up some group and he would attack and try to, take over some territory or something. So the Romans were always having to fight and so on. And if you got accused of being part of one of those groups, they would shoot first and ask questions later. They didn't care. And you didn't have any civil rights either. So don't go, crying about it. And then honor to whom honor. Now there's kind of a positive and a negative connotation to this. Honor, that'd be like same as, say, honoring your parents, or honor, this mainly having to do with money, pay, who's due that. Also, one of the things we talked about last time, this has the connotation of a payoff to local crime bosses, whoever are over because that existed, organized crime and kind of like the mafia type stuff, that all existed back in the Roman days. I mean, it's nothing new now. It had its start way back then. And so, that's in there. Look, if you have to pay off somebody, then that's what you have to do. Pay them off. So, anyway, the origin of government. God established the base of human government with Adam, and then He confirmed it with Noah and his family as they started human society over. Adam and his descendants lived basically under a tribal, patriarchal type of government system. Whoever was the oldest living, patriarch, or sometimes matriarch, however the case may be, they pretty much, made the decisions, kind of ruled. But after the flood, God established His covenant with Noah and with his descendants. Noah built an altar to the Lord, took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in His heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. That's something, kind of a point we want to keep in the back of our minds as we go into this next section next week that we're going to look at. Nor will I again destroy every living thing as I've done, while the earth remains, God says. This is promised to Noah and his descendants. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. So don't get too alarmed about, climate change and global warming and stuff, because God has already said, there may be cycles and weather cycles and stuff, but while the earth remains, these things will not cease. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. So here's the covenant here. God's saying, here's the earth, here's all the things in it. They're here for your use. Go spread out into the earth. Use what's there. This is what I've provided for you for your living. Go fill up the earth and live in it. Created it for you to live in. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I've given you all things, even as the green herbs. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. This is where we get the principle that the life is in the blood. And notice, this was way before the law of Moses, and God had told them, and I think one of those things they kind of already knew, that you're not supposed to eat anything with the blood. Well, before this, they really didn't eat meat. I mean, they ate plants. That's what they had to eat. God tells them here, don't eat anything with its blood in it. And in the law of Moses, that's what He told Israel. Don't eat anything with its blood in it. When Peter and Paul and Barnabas and the apostles there in Acts 15 had the council in Jerusalem, when they said, look, these Gentiles are coming to Christ, they're being saved. What are we going to do with them? What are we going to tell them? Peter said, we can't go put them under the law. We couldn't bear that burden, and our fathers couldn't bear that burden. We can't heap this on Gentiles. So they came up with 4 things. So that reminds me, while I'm thinking about it, let me give you this. That's a note. That's kind of a preview of next week. But that's that definition you asked me about.
Thank you very much.
And there's some reference verses to it too. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of a preview of what's coming up next week. Peter and James and the apostles and Paul and Barnabas said, okay, here's what we're going to tell go back and tell the Gentile believers in Christ these 4 things. Don't eat anything with the blood in it. Don't anything that's been strangled. Abstain from fornication. And what was the 4th one? So they're in Acts 15. Don't anything with the blood or strangled, or keep yourselves from idols, I think. Anyway, basically it was to separate yourselves from those things that had to do with your idolatrous culture that you came out of. And one of the things is don't eat anything with the blood in it. And there's a whole kind of a pagan thing behind why they did that anyway. Pagan people still do that, and they have, like the blood rituals and all that kind of stuff. So this is part of the covenant God made with Noah, and contained within this provision, there's also the foundation for human government, and it's in the responsibility of man to be self-governing within a set of standards that God gave. Surely for your lifeblood I'll demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man, from the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. It's responsibility. So whoever sheds man's blood, by his blood by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So upholding the sanctity of human life and the responsibility and so forth of human government to begin and to be able to enforce the law and so forth. And also this is there, not going to go into the whole big deal, but this was to prevent what started the whole mess back there with Cain and Abel and that whole revenge culture that began and just apparently snowballed before the flood. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply in it. That's the covenant God made with Noah and with all of his descendants after him. This is the one that we are under. This is still in effect. Because remember what we looked at where he said, while the earth remains, all these things apply. So this applies to, you want to know what deal God made with us as Gentiles? This is it for our provision and for us living in the earth. Here's the earth. Here are all the things that are in it. I've given it into your hand. Use its resources to live in. Out of this, he called Israel and gave them a different set of covenants that they are under. But the rest of us stayed under this. And we're still under that as far as our living in our provision from God. We know that He's not going to rain manna out of heaven to feed us. But we have the earth and its resources to live, to feed ourselves. So, anyway, let's move on. We're going to look at verses 8 through about 10 tonight. Some interesting things here. Paul goes on to say, owe no man anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. This is the point Paul's making. We're not going to take this. Now, there's some people that take this and they take it to an extreme that really turns into error, where Paul uses this phrase, owe no one anything. Okay, some people take that, and I'm a big advocate of not being in debt. If you can stay out of debt, if at all possible, you're always better off. But some people take this and they turn it in, they pull it out of here, and they turn it into something it's not. They turn it into a big hammer. You should never, ever borrow money for anything, because Paul said, owe no man anything. Of course, they're not understanding that, look, Paul's not just setting up a new set of rules here. He's showing us things that indicate to us how things properly function in the body of Christ when, we're maturing, growing, learning, and walking in godliness and walking in the Spirit and so forth. These are the things we find happening. And this is what it looks like. But as far as, owe no one anything, that doesn't mean don't ever borrow money for something. Sometimes it's unavoidable. It's like anything else. You have to use wisdom and balance with that as with anything. But that's not what that means there. He's talking about in spiritual things and in the things that are in the context he's talking about here. Except to love one another. And I like this, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. I can remember, decades ago, and reading through this, and that's one of the things that just jumped off the page at me, and was one of the things that really helped me come to understand the difference between law and grace, and how we live under grace, we function under grace, and that's how God deals with us, is that he who loves another has fulfilled the law. And Paul goes on to explain this. He says, for the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And man, this really was liberating to me, especially at that particular time. I was in an environment where it was extremely legalistic, and there was a lot of confusion, because on one hand they understood, well, we're saved by grace, but then on the other hand, they thought, but we have to live under the law, and we have to, conform to all these things, and we have to keep all these things, and keep all the commandments, but we're under grace, and so there was a big confusion there. And this really helped me when I came to see that even back in God's dealing with Israel under their program, when they were under the if-then system, where, if you listen to my voice and keep my commandments, then I'll pour out these blessings to you. And if you don't listen to me and don't keep my commandments, then I'll pour out these curses upon you. When they were under that system, still, if they had any hope of keeping the commandments that God gave them, the motive and the means for that were going to be loving their neighbor. Well, number one, like Jesus said, the greatest commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and spirit, and love your, it's in the next one's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's the whole thing as far as, and I'm glad Paul includes this in here. It's kind of it's an absolute necessary foundation block for where we are as going through this study. We need to know this. We need to know that, look, in the way God's dealing with us under grace and teaching us to grow up and function as mature sons that are joining with Him in the business He's about, and we have a vital part of it, and we have an interest in it. We have an ownership in it. In order for righteousness to work and to function, our motive has got to be that our motive has got to be love. And remember, some of you may not have been here, our definition, in fact, now I'm not going to get my markers out and put it up there. Our definition of that, love, godly love, is to value and esteem what God values and esteems. It's not love like we tend to kind of think of, in our world today. It's something really way better than that. It's to love what God loves. It's to see things the way He sees them and value and esteem what He values and esteems. And to not value and esteem what He doesn't value and esteem. Too often we love things that He doesn't and don't love what He does. So the thing about, the fulfillment of the law which if we look at the law as it's supposed to serve the purpose of restraining sin and evil and ungodliness, really we have to ask the question, do we see the law having much effect on restraining evil and ungodliness and sin? Not really. I mean, think about it. If the law didn't have its enforcement branch, if the police weren't there, how much law and order and godliness and righteousness do you think, how much restraint of evil do you think we'd see in our society? There wouldn't be much. It would be like the Wild West. We'd all have to go around armed to protect ourselves constantly and so on. So, but as far as for us personally, see, in this environment I used to be in, decades ago now, this got me in a lot of trouble. And I tried to make this point that, look, I don't need the 10 Commandments. I don't need commandments engraved in stone. I don't need them, because it doesn't make any difference to me. If they vanished into thin air and didn't exist, would that then mean that I could steal, commit adultery, commit murder, bear false witness, or break any of the other commandments? No, because listen, okay, it's like this. I don't go back and read the 10 Commandments every day. I mean, I've memorized the 10 Commandments, but I don't go back and read them. I don't have a placard in my house with the 10 Commandments on that I look at every day and read those. But I don't have to, because I know God's standard of righteousness. And even if that didn't exist, even without the written commandment, I'm not going to steal from you, because I value and esteem you and your rights to your property greater than what I would want. Or, you could apply that to any of these: bearing false witness, murder, adultery, whatever. We, love our spouse. We love or we value and esteem the life of others. We're not going to just murder them because they make us mad. We're not going to destroy others by bearing false witness against them and defame their character and so on like that. And not covet what other people have, because we value and esteem others better than ourselves. And that's the key, and that's the point Paul's making here. Now, another thing about this is that notice the order in which Paul teaches a lot of these things, and think about the things that he's already taught us about our sonship growth, our adoption as sons, and the other things that we've learned and he's explained to us that give us a different way of thinking about things. We should have the maturity to understand this. Children can't get this right here. You can't explain this kind of thing to children. Go into a kindergarten and try to explain the concepts of not taking somebody else's toy because you're supposed to love them. You can tell them that, but how far are you going to get with that? You're not going to get very far, because they don't get that. Children don't understand that. But they understand not taking something that's not theirs. And if you do, you're going to go sit in the corner, because that's not yours. You play with this and they play with that and whatever. That's not your toy. You can't have that. Don't come tattling on other kids just to get them in trouble because you don't, whatever. And so on like that. They can understand that. And children, as Paul describes over there in Galatians 5, I think it is, 4, where he talks about children that are under tutors and governors, but the grown-up children, the sons, are not under tutors and governors anymore. They don't need somebody telling them what to do all the time and seeing after everything and leading them around by the hand, making all their decisions for them. So, point being, the commandments, if we want to fulfill if we want to say the purpose of the commandments is to restrain evil, if we're going to look at them that way, the only way that's ever going to happen is being empowered by the love of Christ that is alive in us. That's the only way that will ever happen. I don't want to... Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Now, I thought of something. It's interesting. I usually think of this stuff after it's too late. But I thought of something when I was reading through this. I thought, this list, these commandments Paul names, that seems very familiar for some reason. I've read that before. Almost the same word for word list. Back over here in Matthew chapter 19. It says, "Now behold, one came and said to him, Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? So he said to him, Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. He said to him, Which ones? Jesus said, You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I thought, yeah, that's almost exactly word for word what Paul said. Now, I don't think that they're, we don't want to stumble off into saying, well, since these are the only ones, Paul named and Jesus named the same ones, that we can disregard the other, 5 that they didn't mention. You notice, neither one of them, Paul, and I'm thinking, just like last week, we talked about a lot of the similarities we're looking at, and we want to keep your eye open for similarities as we go through. Well, we're finished with chapter 12. Unless we go back there and refer back to some things. But 12 and 13 and 14, look at the similarities that are there between what some of the things Paul says and things that Jesus stated in the Sermon on the Mount. There are different reasons for those, but it's interesting that the concepts are the same, and some of it almost word for word. I think Paul probably had in mind, what Jesus had said there when he was talking to the young man that came to him on the road that day. But we want to be careful and not make something out of this that's not there, just because Paul gives the same list of commandments that Jesus said over here. They're not saying that, look, these are the only ones that are important, or the only ones that you need to consider, and you don't have to worry about this. No. He's just saying, it'd be like if somebody came up to us and said, hey, what are the 10 commandments? Or what are the commandments? We talk about the commandments. Well, you shall not steal, you shall not kill, and commit adultery, and steal, and bear false witness, and covet. None of those things, So we may not word for word list every one of them, but it's making the point. And so, but I just thought it was interesting there, and probably if we studied that out, it's probably something else there. It'd be very interesting to see. So if any of you want to do some homework, maybe study that out and see what else might be there. But while we're here, I do want to make this point, which illustrates the difference in something Jesus said and what Paul's teaching us. Notice when this man came to Jesus and asked him, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? Notice what Jesus said to him. He said, but if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. So this shows us that when Jesus talking to those people, and everything he said, he never told them anything other than to keep the commandments that they were under. So this illustrates to us that Jesus, who was sent to minister to Israel, they were under the law, they were under the covenants, and all that changed after his resurrection, and after Israel rejected Christ, their risen Messiah, and the dispensation of grace came in, everything changed. So anyway, this is a good illustration that Jesus told people, look, you want to have eternal life, be righteous, you got to keep the commandments, because that was the covenant they were under, and he didn't change that. So Paul says, love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. We could go back and we could be like the Pharisees who asked Jesus, well, who's my neighbor? And remember, that's when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan and the man that was beat up on the side of the road. There came along a priest and a Levite, and they looked over there, saw the man beat up on the side of the road, and they just went around him and went on their way. And both of them did, the priest and the Levite. Well, it wasn't okay. There's a reason why they did that, and you may all already know this. The reason why they did that was not because they didn't want to help the man, but they were afraid he was dead. And what could a priest and a Levite not do? They couldn't touch a dead body. Because if they touched a dead body, then they were defiled. And if they were defiled, they had to go in there and go through this long rigmarole of washing and all kind of stuff and making offerings and sacrifices and all those kind of things to be purified. It took like 8 days and all that kind of stuff. So, plus the fact that there was kind of a social stigma put on them about becoming unclean and becoming defiled, and kind of a peer pressure thing like that. Now, so that was the reason why they didn't help the man who was beat up on the side of the road, because they didn't want to be defiled. But how much love were they showing for their neighbor? And that was the whole point of the sign, the whole point of the deal. So Paul pointing out to us that love, or to value and esteem others the way God values and esteems others, does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, to value and esteem others the way God values and esteems others is the fulfillment of the law. And pretty simply, that's basically it. If we want to, I guess, okay. If we think of the law in terms of it having any ability at all to restrict sin and restrict evil, the only real way that's going to happen is by people who value and esteem others the way God values and esteems them. Because I don't know that any of us have ever really seen any demonstrations of knowledge of the law preventing people from doing what was wrong. And I know a lot of times, especially those of us that are grace believers, we believe that we're saved by grace through faith in Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. No works involved. We can't pay for it. We can't earn it. We get it as a free gift. And some scoff at that and say, well, you're just giving people a license to sin. Well, my response to that is, since when do we need a license to sin? We do pretty well without a license. Sinning without, what's God going to write us a ticket for sinning without a license? That's foolish. We don't need a license to sin. We were kind of born with a license to sin and to break the law and so on like that. So, point being, love is our motive. That's the thing that has power to restrict sin and evil. That number one, we love the Lord more than we love ourselves. We love Him more than we love sin. And we value and esteem others greater than ourselves, and that's our motive. We're going to stop there tonight because we go into this next section, verse 11. It kind of continues the progression of thought here, but it's going to go into a subject that is really to me anyway, it'll be a good study. It's an important thing that we need to learn. And also incorporated into that is a Bible study principle that's going to make some other parts of the Bible really become a lot clearer to us as we go through that. So we'll pick up there in verse 11 next time as we begin to look at that. It's going to be pretty good. If you get the chance, go ahead and read through the rest of the chapter this week, and we'll go through it there. All right. Anybody got any thoughts on what we talked about tonight?
In regards to the Ten Commandments, and knowing that homosexuality is an abomination to God, wonder why that was not one of the commandments.
Well, really, I read somewhere that, okay, first of all, the Ten Commandments starts off with, you shall have no other gods before me. And second, you should have, make no carved images or anything, bow down to them or worship them. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. And then, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Okay, within really those first three commandments, really in the first one, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay, if you're going to have no other gods before Him, then one thing you need to know is, what does He have to say? What are His standards? If this is the God that I am supposed to alone worship, as opposed to, and I'm thinking from the standpoint of somebody back in that culture who would have been one of the first ones that heard that, say, okay, if opposed to all the other cultures around me who worship a lot of gods, they have gods for everything. If I'm going to worship this one God, then I need to know something about Him. Well, fortunately, He had provided, prophets and so forth and people to teach what He had given revelation of, what He was like and so on. And He had done that all the way from the beginning. Back there we have even Enoch. We have Enoch's words as, way back there at the beginning, but they're not recorded until the next to the last book of the Bible, where he said, behold, the Lord's coming with 10,000s of His saints to execute judgment upon all the ungodly and so forth. Well, there were men like Enoch and Noah, who Peter describes as a preacher of righteousness. They told the people what God's standard was. And within that, they told the people that, homosexuality was an abomination to God and so forth. So it wasn't like anybody didn't know that. I mean, they were aware of that. Even though it wasn't in the Ten Commandments, still contained in those first three commandments about honoring God, whatever He said and the commandments He gave or He set down would have been contained within that. You shall have no other gods before me. Because see, here's the thing that we don't really see in our world about homosexuality. We don't see the demonic aspect of it. And we don't see the tie-in to an idolatrous culture. And from what I understand, and this is something that I just picked up on. I was looking at something else one time, researching something else, and kind of saw this as a sideline deal. Apparently, there are certain things within the homosexual culture, like certain objects, certain figurines, type of things that are extremely popular in that culture. And some of the other characteristics of that culture and these figures and so forth exhibit definite characteristics of idolatry. Now, back in ancient times, like Sodom and Gomorrah days, when the whole city was given over to homosexuality, there may not have been a more demonic, idolatrous culture on earth than that culture of Sodom and Gomorrah and Zeboim and those other cities in that Jordan plain there. So, point being, just because within the Ten Commandments there's not a thou shalt not be a homosexual, doesn't mean that they didn't know that that was already wrong. Was in ancient times, those homosexuals, everybody knew they were associated with pagan gods and idolatry. That was part of that whole culture, even up through the Greek and Roman times. I mean, it was a lot of times their culture was rife with that homosexuality. It was always tied with pagan worship and so forth like that, idolatry. What do you got, Steve?
Well, I was just going back to Romans 1, talking about
men
corrupt themselves with men. It says, and then chapter 2 starts off, not be judgmental of people, because God is the one that recompensates.
Yeah.
It's His judgment that way. They knew it was wrong.
Yeah.
But not to judge them.
Yeah, that's right.
God, we will.
Romans 1, 18 through 32 gives the indictment of man right there.
Talking about those who,
worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, and man with man doing that which was unseemly, bringing on themselves a recompense which was just, and turned over to reprobate mind and those things.
But then if chapter 2 goes into not judging those, but we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. So God's judgment will have it, not our judgment.
Yeah. Anyway, did that answer your question? It's like within the Ten Commandments, there's not a thou shalt not cheat on your taxes or something like that. But it's kind of like the Ten Commandments is a standard that really you can't improve on it, and you can't take anything away from it. It's an amazing thing just in itself, in its completeness and so forth. Yeah, you think about it. Okay, what if? Here's a big what if. What if everybody kept the Ten Commandments? How different would the world be? I mean, just what if? What if everybody said, those 10, let's say, rules, those are pretty good rules to follow. What if every human being determined in their heart, I'm going to do my absolute best to live within those 10 rules? How much different would things be? That's what you want to ask all the, atheists and God haters and all that. And you say, okay, well, let's just take the 10 Commandments. What if everybody followed those 10 rules right there, Or you can say, what if everybody just followed the from number 6 through 10, and what if we took off the first 4? Of course, if you take off the first 4, you're not going to keep the last 6 either. But anyway.
As you look at Ten Commandments too, it says not to commit adultery. Well, that's adultery with another man.
Yeah, I mean, contained within that commandment about adultery that kind of covers more than just spousal infidelity. That covers all kinds of aberrant sexual activity and all those kind of things.
Just the natural aspect of it. It's not natural.
Yeah. I tell you what, we lost that battle. I mean, that horse is out the gate and it's long gone. We lost that battle in our culture. And, now it's twisted around to where, well, matter of fact, where is it? I can't find it. We'll just look at it next week. about Isaiah 5:20, where he says, you know, woe unto those that put light for darkness and darkness for light and good for evil and evil for good. And so that's the culture we live in today. But, you know.
Well, there's so many that overlook it, just overlook it.
Yeah.
But you can't, you shouldn't.
No. You know, you ask what? You know, what can we do about it? And I don't know. Be different, I guess. You know, we've got to just, even if it's in our own, you know, culture or whatever, even if it's just an individual thing, we have to determine, I'm not going to condone it. I'm not going to go along with it. You know, I don't care if everybody else does. If the whole culture gives in and caves in and kowtows to it, that's their choice to make, but I'm not going to, you know, and I'm willing to suffer the consequences of that, you know, because they're not going to give up, and they, you know, I think they're going to make a major push in the future to persecute any Christian group or church that doesn't go along with the homosexual agenda. As a matter of fact, if any of them, it's not likely, you know, that they'll ever watch this video on YouTube, but if they do, they would try to prosecute me for what I've said here tonight, you know. Yeah, they'd kick us off of YouTube. If any of the YouTube people watch this, we're off of YouTube. So, anyway, it's not a big deal. It's not that many people watch our videos, so. But anyway, that's where we live. And, you know. All right, anybody else got anything? Good discussion tonight. Father, we thank you for your good